Hey there, I'm Josh, and today I'm going to be just joshing around, building some benches. We needed some benches for our back deck, so I built some. I decided right from the start that I wanted to build the benches using nothing but reclaimed lumber. This included anything from the boards that I ripped off my deck when I did the overhaul the year before, to these 4x4s that actually came off of my kid's swing set. I built that like 12 or 13 years ago, and the kids just don't use it as much anymore since they're bigger, so I tore it down. There's a couple of reasons I wanted to use old lumber, and one of which is because I kind of wanted the challenge just to see if I could make some benches look nice out of old used lumber. The other reason is because lumber's expensive, and there's nothing wrong with this stuff other than being a little bit old, so that's what I did. The first thing I did there was to cut the 4x4s down to size, and now I'm cutting out some mortise channels to accommodate the 2x4 framework. I did this by cutting one cut on the end of the mortise, then sliding the board over, cutting the other end, and then making a series of cuts in the middle. Then you can just basically break away all that material in the middle and clean it up using the table saw blade. Now, just like anything else, there's like 1,000 different ways you could build a bench, but this is the way that I decided to do it because I wanted it to be solid and really heavy duty. The next thing was to mortise out the tops of the 4x4s by first making a vertical cut and then cutting out the side. Like that. Now, for the 2x4s, I didn't actually use 2x4s. I used 2x6s that I cut down, because I didn't want those rounded factory edges on them. I wanted it to be nice and square. You'll see what I mean here in a moment. Yeah, see? That's what I was talking about there. Fits in there nice and snug. Once I got it as squared up as I could, I secured it using some screws. Then I did the same on the other end. And that gave me one part of the frame. This is actually the front of the frame, which you can see signified by the chalk F on the side there. The only big difference between the front and the back frames is just the height difference for the mortise cut. This is simply to just accommodate a more comfortable sitting angle. I secured the two pieces together using a 2x4 and some screws, and then repeated the same thing on the other end. Next, I drilled pocket holes into some boards that I had previously cut down for the lower cross members. I slid the board into place, clamped it tight, and then drove in all the screws to secure it. Now, I could have just stopped there, but I wanted these benches to actually have little tables on the ends instead of just armrests. So I added another piece of framework to either end to accommodate that. I then added a 2x4 across the front and the back, and then secured them using some screws. This is one of the few spots that you can actually see any fasteners used externally on these benches, and I kind of did that by design. I really wanted everything to look nice and neat, but I didn't want a chance using pocket holes for this type of joinery. I wanted it to be nice and secure. Now for this little cross member at the bottom, this thing was kind of a bugger to get in there. I actually had to go out and buy a right angle driver to install the screws, which surprisingly worked really well. Next, for the seat cross member, I held up a 2x4 across the end and then marked a couple of lines for my cuts. Then I took the board over to my miter saw, adjusted the angle, and made my cuts. To attach the board, I drilled some pocket holes, clamped it into place, and then installed the screws. The next thing I did was got to work on installing some seat supports. I marked the exact center of the bench and then slid this cross member into place and attached it using screws. In keeping with the theme of making these benches super heavy duty, I cut some boards to act as cross members to support the slats for the seat down the middle. This probably wasn't completely necessary, but like I said, I wanted these benches to be really sturdy. Once that was done, I installed cleats across the front and the back for the slats to sit on. And although I forgot to film it, I actually ripped these boards down on the table saw at the same angle as the seat. This was to ensure that the slats would sit flat on the lip of the cleat instead of sitting on the corner. Next, I used my angle finder to get the correct angle to set up my miter saw to cut all the slats. I cut a scrap piece first just to test for a good fit. Being satisfied with that, I went ahead and cut out all the rest of the slats for the seat. With all the boards cut, I went ahead and installed one board right in the middle. I set it in place, clamped it down, and then installed screws up through the bottom. Then, using a paint stick as a spacer, I laid out the rest of the slats. I secured the slats by employing the same method of pre-drilling the holes up through the bottom of the cleats and then driving the screws into the boards. Having the slats all equally spaced, I ended up needing a narrower slat on either end. So I took measurements and brought it over to the table saw and ripped them down to size. I installed the narrow slats into place before moving on to building out the back of the bench. I started this by holding up a board at a good angle and making some marks. And I used a scrap piece of 2x4 for a good reference. Then I took my first upright support over to the bandsaw and cut it out. With the first upright cut out, I took it over and did a quick test fit to make sure everything looked okay. Then I used the cutoff as a template to mark the other uprights. I cut them out as well and then went to work on attaching them to the bench. I did this by clamping the boards into place and then driving in some screws. For the middle upright, I used a beefier lag screw to support it. Next, I added the cap to the seat back. This consisted simply of a 2x4 that I attached using screws driving them through the tops of the uprights. Next, I attached some rails to act as cleats to install the seat back slats. Since there weren't any funky angles to contend with, I was able to cut them down to size using some simple straight cuts. I attached these all using the same method that I used to install the boards on the seat bottom. Next, I ripped down some boards to act as toppers for the little side tables on the benches. As you can see, these were kind of a pain in the butt, so I had to use a little bit of persuasion to get them into place. Except for that one. That one wasn't bad. I secured the boards in the front using pocket hole screws, and in the back using regular screws. For the boards on the bottom shelf, I just tapped them into place using a mallet. Next, with the benches all assembled, I softened the edges using a roundover bit in my router. I tried to focus on every exposed edge, so if you happen to lean into it or bump into it or whatever, it would be rounded instead of square, and it would make it more comfortable. With that done, it was time for sanding. Lots and lots of sanding. I tried to hit every exposed surface really well, just to make sure I got rid of any extra loose stain or dirt or whatever, and that took a really long time. Once that was done, it was time for staining. For this, I used the same deck renewal stain that I used before when I overhauled my deck, just, in a different color. This stuff works pretty well. It does a good job protecting the wood, and it looks nice. Well, that pretty much takes care of it. Let's take a look at things all finished up. All in all, I have to say I'm pretty happy with how these benches turned out. It was a little bit of a challenge making these out of used lumber instead of brand new stuff, but that's what I was looking for. And it was really nice not having to spend a bunch of extra money. These benches are definitely solid and really heavy duty. Emphasis on heavy. Just ask my friends who helped me move them. But they look great and they suit our needs perfectly. I'm really glad I decided to use reclaimed lumber on this project. It definitely saved a few bucks and it was a nice little challenge too. I think the benches turned out great. They look pretty nice, they're really sturdy, and it gave us a lot of extra seating. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video and it was helpful in some way. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.